Somebody asked me recently about polity, and since I like to try to answer questions with my videos, I'm going to answer that question. So today I want to talk about church polity. So what is polity? Polity is just a fancy word we use in the church. It's a word in the dictionary. It's not a special church word. It just means the way that things are arranged, the way that things are governed, the arrangement of authority or how things get accomplished. And so it's very similar to the word politics, except it doesn't have necessarily all the connotations that politics does. But basically, it's just how we order our life together. And in a sense, the best answer to the question of what is the best polity kind of boils down to it's the one that you don't have. Because politics, like church polity, is always a matter of we're not happy with what we've got. We wish we had something else. It's a syndrome of the grass is always greener. We think that the other form of government is better or more efficient or whatever, and it's kind of that way with church polity. And so in that sense, church polity is something that people like to complain about, and they're always kind of dissatisfied with what they have, just like people like to complain about their government, and they're always dissatisfied with what they have. But that's where the similarities, I think, really should come to an end, because church polity should be quite different than the politics we have in the world, because the politics we have in the world are premised on the idea of equity, fairness, balancing rights, trying to punish evildoers. That's what those governments are for. So they're dealing with the brokenness and the fallenness of sin and trying to figure out how to navigate things and trying to make things work the best way possible in the civil realm. The polity in the church has a different objective because the church's goal is to proclaim the gospel of Christ and to witness to Christ's reality. So in a sense, in the church, polity has the simple task not of trying to suppress evil or try to balance rights. The task of polity in the church is really just kind of how should we organize the best way to get things done the best way so that the gospel can be proclaimed and that people can follow Christ and be formed into the ways of Christ. And that's why polity in the Lutheran understanding is always kind of fuzzy or vague or not that big a deal. We're not that worried about it. Hermann Sasse makes a great observation in one of his essays that Lutheranism stands apart from all the rest of Christendom of not really caring very much about polity. And we're unusual in that score because Rome and Eastern Orthodoxy are all about a certain arrangement, a hierarchy of top-down sort of a thing, that Christ gave his authority to a handful of apostles, that the church, the clergy then have this authority, and in Rome it's that single individual of Peter who has got supremacy over everything. Then you get the Petrine supremacy and Rome supremacy, and off you go into the kind of ecclesiastical polity, and it becomes an issue of doctrinal confession. You have to do it this way. And on the other hand, Protestants are all about congregationalism. No, Christ has given his authority to everybody. Everybody shares it equally. And so we have a democratic ideal. So congregationalism becomes the operative thing, that we don't have authority in an individual. It belongs to all of us. And so democracy becomes the best way, and congregationalism becomes the best polity, and anything else is wrong. And then you have kind of Presbyterianism, which sort of really is just an extension of the congregational polity, but getting a select group of elders, and then the presbyters, the elders who now have this oversight. So all of Christendom gets really worked up about their polity, except for Lutheranism. Our attitude is kind of whatever works, works. And what we don't do is try to hang a doctrinal foundation or doctrinal excuse or justification for whatever polity we come up with. Rome tries to get a doctrinal justification by talking about Peter as the first pope. And then Congregationalism tries to get a doctrinal foundation of, no, we all have the priesthood of the baptized, so everybody has the authority, and they now therefore justify it. So what is the way that we then as Lutherans think about this? Well, we operate with, take a polity that kind of works for you and run with it. And so you have a lot of German Lutherans to this day who operate with more of an Episcopal sort of a polity, or maybe even that's, I should say, Scandinavian Lutherans who kind of operate that way, with the idea of bishops and those giving authority and kind of the church being a sort of a top-down sort of a thing. You can do it that way. Then you have other Lutherans, some of them in America, for example. Some of the other synods, the smaller churches, tend to be much more congregational. The Fellowship of Free Lutheran Congregations, man, they're all over this. That it's the polity is grounded in the congregation only, and there is no authority given to the pastor beyond what the pastor gets from the congregation. Now, the LCMS is kind of strange. In fact, I would say we have a very weird polity because we don't fit any of these well. A lot of LCMS people assume, oh, we're congregational. I would argue that's not right. If you read Walther carefully and pay attention to what he's doing in church and ministry, and if you understand our foundation and how we operate, we don't fit neatly into a congregational polity, and we don't fit into a clerical polity either. We're not ecclesiastical, we're not congregational. We have this sort of strange polity that I believe what Walther was trying to do was actually to honor what Luther was doing and what Paul is doing, and that is that Jesus is the Lord of the church. That's our polity. Now, this creates some challenges because that means that I believe our polity is not a blend of a little clerical, a little congregational, let's work it out and see how this goes. And it's not a matter of trying to determine, finally it's really a congregational, or really it's ultimately a clerical. No, I would argue that our polity in the LCMS is a polity founded on the idea that Jesus is the Lord of the church and we should act that way all the way through. What this creates then is a very interesting dynamic sort of polity that can be very frustrating because it's not always the most efficient and because ultimately we don't ever answer the question of, well, who's really got the control? Isn't it really the congregation? Isn't it really the pastor? Our answer is always no, Jesus really has the final control. And that makes for an interesting polity because it's a polity that doesn't have a neat kind of structure laid out on paper that the final decision is the congregation's or the final decision is the pastor's. Our argument would be, at least my argument would be, that no, the final decision is Christ's. And you say, wow, that's great in theory, but how's that work in practice? No, it does work in practice because we always yield what we do in the church to the authority of Christ, and we ask, what is Christ leading us? How does Christ call us to live? What does it mean to offer Christ as Lord and to work that way? That's how the LCMS functions, and it's a weird way of operating. As I said, I don't think many of the LCMS kind of get this. We have this kind of lip service to our polity, but we don't really think through what it all means because usually we end up defaulting to one or the other option of either a congregational or a clerical. For most of our history, we've kind of opted for the congregational. And you hear this all the time, even from pastors. Well, it's really the congregation's decision. It's their church. No, it's not their church. It's Christ's church. And they're just there gathered in that place who are followers of Christ, working together to accomplish his purposes in that place. The pastor then is also called by Christ to be his representative and to serve the church. And so they work together in this beautiful cooperation with Jesus as Lord. So you see, the theological foundation is not solved by saying, well, who's really got the keys? Because the answer theologically is Christ gives his keys to all believers, and he appoints pastors in his church to be the one who speak his truth faithfully to his people. The pastor is that absolution man, that one who delivers God's grace to his people. That's what he's there for. And he is called by Christ to that role, sometimes through a congregation, in a congregational polity, sometimes through a bishop in an Episcopalian polity. It doesn't matter how the church puts a man into the office or how Christ puts his man into the office, so long as there is a man put into that office. That's what AC 14 is getting at in the Book of Concord, in the Augsburg Confession. No one is to preach or teach unless rightly called. In other words, put into the office in the right way. Who decides the right way? The church. In that place, we decide how it's going to work. There's no set rules about you have to do this, or you can't do this, you have to have this kind of degree, you have to have this kind of training. No, the church just decides. We're going to make pastors this way. We all agree? Fine, we'll do it this way, and we're all doing it together. No one person decides, no group kind of goes renegade and does their own thing. We do this together. That's the point of AC 14. So what's this translate down to? This means that in our polity, the keys of the office of the ministry, the keys to forgive and retain sins. And the office of the ministry is a little different than this, but the priesthood of the baptized and the office of the ministry both have the keys straight from Christ himself. And now that means they are authorized to declare the gospel, to preach the good news, to forgive sins, Every Christian gets to do it. The pastor is in a unique role because he does it on behalf of the congregation and for the sake of the congregation as God's appointed person to be the absolution man who declares God's grace. Then the congregation does it in their vocations, in all their different places in life, doing their work, but they're both doing the work of the keys. So who has the final authority on what should be done? Who has the final decision about the doctrine and the teaching? Jesus does, of course. Who has the final decision about whether we should build a new church? Jesus does, of course. Now, does Jesus come down and say, yes, build a new church. I think you should sell this property and move out to the suburbs. No, we don't have that reality of Christ coming and being sitting there and just telling us what to do. But we also have the responsibility of being his people gathered in that place to operate with the mind of Christ, with the grace of Christ, the love of Christ. It's not about trying to get our way. It's not about trying to balance rights. It's not about trying to figure out how to find the best way forward to make everybody happy. No. What it's about is, what does it mean for us to be faithful to follow Christ as his witness here in this place? How should we do that? It's not always efficient. It's not always pragmatic. It doesn't always make sense. Sometime I'm going to talk about sanctified common sense and how messed up that idea is. But that will be another time. It doesn't always make sense for what we do in the church because we are following Jesus. We're not doing what the world says is rational or the smart thing or even the fair thing. Fairness is not the most important thing. What's the most important thing is, does it proclaim Christ? Does it honor him? Does it serve the church? Do we yield to the sake of others? So I'm never trying to assert my own authority. I'm always trying to figure out how I yield for the sake of others, for the sake of the proclamation of the gospel. In a weird way, I would say that the LCMS polity does that beautifully. And so rather than complaining about our polity, which is another polity that's flawed because it's got flawed people operating in it, we should maybe just kind of celebrate it. It's always easy, as I said, to look at the others who think it's so much better. All those Episcopal polity, they get so much done, they're so efficient. And they are. And I complain about this myself, about the sloppiness of our polity. We don't get things done very well because we don't have neat power all tied up in one place. You just make a decision and it's done. And then you'll have people who have that kind of situation say, oh my goodness, we've got this dictator running the show, a tyrant. Wouldn't it be so much better if we had the whole democracy voting and we could stop that power from happening? They're right. And when you're having that Episcopal polity, you yearn for the democracy. But then the democracy comes with its problems. And so instead of always wishing we had something else, especially in the LCMS, perhaps we should just count our great blessings and realize what we have given to us through this careful work of Walther, trying to figure out what Luther actually taught and try to follow what Paul is actually giving us. What we have is a polity that isn't too hung up on itself, and a polity that seeks to emulate the reality that Jesus is Lord, and let's just live that way. Let's not try to figure out how we're going to solve every problem, how to be the most efficient, how to get things done in a very pragmatic sort of way, and how to be expedient in about everything we do. No, let's just try to further the proclamation of Christ, and let's try to figure out what the best way to do that is. So instead of congregations hanging on to their building because it's our building and my great-grandfather built it, we can maybe realize, it's silly for us as this little congregation with another little congregation 5 miles away to keep on fighting with each other for members and trying to figure out how to survive. Let's just do the right thing for the proclamation of the gospel and our witness and become one church. Let's just do that. Let's not get hung up on our congregational autonomy or have my right. That's just messed up. And at the same token, let's not have the idea that if only we had stronger pastors, what we need is bishops. We need to start having bishops instead of DPs. No, we don't need bishops. We don't need an episcopal kind of authority coming from a top down. That's got all kinds of problems with authority getting localized with one person and concentrated where it doesn't belong. And there's problems with that too. So instead of lamenting what's wrong on both sides and wishing we could have it other, why don't we just delight in what God gives us? A messy, clunky polity that's not very efficient, but that actually does a good job of making sure that we know Christ is Lord. He gets the final decision. He directs us. We honor him, and we witness his reality to the world around us. That's our job as the church. Let's delight in doing that job and worry a little less about our politics and our polity.